I'm really pleased to have on the line with me Johann Hari. He is a journalist, the author. His latest book is Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. The website for it is chasingthescream.com. You can tweet him at Johann, Johann Hari, Hari 101. And Johann, welcome to the program.
Hey, Tom, I've learned so much from listening to your show and from reading your books over the years, so I'm super excited to be with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's high praise. This book is astonishing, and I've been ranting about it on the air for the better part of a week. And but let's get it from the horse's mouth, as it were.
I'm actually going to cry if you carry on saying nice things about my book. I'll burst into tears, and it'll just this interview will just descend into me saying, "I love you, Thom Hartmann."
No, thank you, Johann. It's just a brilliant book. So you say drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is, and the war on drugs is not what we have been told. What does that mean?
You know, one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And about 5 years ago now, I decided to write a book about the war on drugs. I realized we were coming up to 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States, and then it was imposed by the US on the rest of the world. And when I sat down to write the book, slightly arrogantly, I thought, oh, I know loads about this subject, right? I've lived through it. I was a journalist. I'd written about it for a long time. And when I sat down and I wrote out a list of like starter questions, I suddenly realized I didn't know the answer to even the most basic questions about this subject. Why did we go to war against drug users and drug addicts 100 years ago? Why do we carry on when it seems to be failing so disastrously? What are the alternatives actually like in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? And I couldn't find the answer in what I was reading. So I decided to go on a journey. I didn't realize at the start how long it would be. I ended up going to now 15 different countries, over 30,000 miles. And what I wanted to do was sit with people whose lives have been changed by the drug war, by addiction, and by the alternatives. And I think the thing I realized, as you say, almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong.
So Congress here in the United States just passed some new legislation making it harder for doctors to prescribe opiates, trying to and increasing regulation and oversight of this, based on the assumption that the use of opiate drugs is producing an epidemic of heroin addiction and opiate addiction in this country. You suggest that it's not the drugs that are producing the addiction; it's the society, the culture. Do I have that right? Sort
of. I was just in Keene in New Hampshire, one of the epicenters of the prescription drug crisis at the moment. So I've been thinking about this obviously a lot in the last few months, and as I say, for 5 years now. I think part of the problem, and this is, I don't make any criticism of this, I made this mistake for a long time as well, is that we've really profoundly misunderstood what addiction actually is, and therefore we're responding to it in the wrong way. We've been told this story about addiction for the last 100 years that's become part of our common sense. We think that if you and me captured the next 20 people who walk past your studio in the next half hour we'll be talking, and we forcibly injected them all with heroin for, I don't know, a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would become physically dependent on. And at the end of that month, they'd have this desperate craving for the drug. That's how I thought I worked. In fact, that's literally what I thought I'd seen in my own family. I only began to realize, the first thing that alerted me, in fact, saying not right about that story, is when it was explained to me. In a lot of countries, Britain, Canada, if you step out into the street and you're hit by a car and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given lots of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's just the medical name for heroin. It's actually much stronger than the heroin you're never going to buy off a drug dealer in New Hampshire, right? Because it's medically pure. And if what we think about anyone with a British or Canadian grandmother who's ever had a hip replacement operation, she's been given a lot of that heroin in hospital. Now, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused by the chemical hooks in the drug, what should happen to all these people in hospitals in so many countries? A significant number of them, at least, should leave as addicts. This has been studied very carefully. It doesn't happen. It virtually never happens. And when I learned that, it seemed so weird and so contrary to everything I've been told. I frankly didn't believe it until I kept looking at the scientific evidence. And it only became clear to me what's really going on when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an extraordinary man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that I think has really transformed how we think about addiction and is really now becoming something people are aware of all over the world. Professor Alexander explained to me, this story we have in our heads about what causes addiction comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your listeners can try them at home tonight if they feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself within about a week. So there you go, right? That's totally our story about addiction. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. We're putting these rats alone. The rat is alone.
He's in solitary confinement.
Exactly. It's got nothing to do except take the drug.
If I was in solitary confinement, I'd want heroin.
Exactly. And actually, I can tell you about a prison I went to in Arizona, very similar to that. So Professor Alexander said, well, hang on a minute. What would happen if we did this totally differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? Anything a rat can want in life, it's got in Rat Park. It's got loads of friends. It can have loads of sex. It's got loads of cheese to eat. It's got tunnels to run in. It's got balls, those little wheels that they love.
Right.
Everything a rat could want. And they've got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. But this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% addiction and overdose when their lives are terrible to none when their lives are good. Now, there's some really interesting human examples that I can talk about. I think a lot of your listeners are living through human examples of this, but there are human experiments. But the main thing I learned from that is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. There's a scientist who says that we shouldn't even call it addiction, we should call it bonding. Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. And when we are happy and healthy, we will bond and connect with the people around us. But if you can't do that because you're isolated or you're traumatized or you're beaten down by life, you're going to bond with something that gives you some sense of relief. That might be alcohol, that might be gambling, it might be pornography, it might be heroin. But that's what's really going on there.
Right. We're talking with Johann Hari, the author of Chasing the Scream, chasingthescream.com. We just have a little more than a minute left before we hit a hard break here and have to wrap this up. What should we be doing? Is Portugal the best example? They just basically decriminalized everything and said, if you're a drug addict, we will help you out?
They decriminalized all drugs and they transferred all the money they used to spend on shaming and stigmatizing addicts to spend it instead on turning their lives around. Say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you give this guy a job, we'll pay his wages for a year. They set up huge programs so addicts could set up and run small businesses. The results are absolutely clear. Addiction has fallen by 50%, 50% in Portugal since they started to do that. Even the people who led the campaign against the decriminalization now say it's worked incredibly well. We have tried shaming and stigmatizing addicts for 100 years, and it has got us where we are now. Models based on love and compassion work.
Yeah, and we've tried punishing them too and putting them in solitary, and it just makes them more needy of these things. So how
makes addictions worse. It traumatizes them more and makes their addictions worse.
Exactly. So in the final minute of this interview, would your recommendation to policymakers in the United States would be end the drug war?
Absolutely. It's really helped me, in my own life as well to think about this, because I think one of the reasons why the debate about the drug war is so charged is because it runs through the hearts of all of us. Everyone who has someone they love with an addiction problem, there's a large part of you that's angry a lot of the time, and that's not an inhuman response. It's a natural human response. I feel that a lot of the time. And so that's why I think the drug war is the extension of that. But I think, and along with racism and the many other things you cover very well and that I discuss in the book, but, I think we have to realize that we've tried that approach. It's been a catastrophe. The countries that have tried the alternatives are seeing extraordinary success. We can continue with failure or we can choose success. It's up to us.
Time to end the drug war. And time to get the book, Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari. And Johann, thank you for a brilliant book, and thank you for being on our program today.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.